Facebook is defending itself against accusations of political bias.
Human curators are censoring conservative stories from appearing on the platform's trending section.
Mark Zuckerberg invited conservative leaders to a meeting at the company.
Der Gründer des größten sozialen Netzwerkes, Mark Zuckerberg, no evidence of political bias, but it's making some changes anyway.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories that we're covering this week. Facebook, liberal bias, and the truth about your news feed. The drone war in Pakistan, difficult to cover and dangerous. The legal case pitting a one-time wrestler, Hulk Hogan, against Gawker Media. Was it funded by a Silicon Valley billionaire with a grudge? And this Russian TV reporter calls himself a journalist, but what he did in France was not journalism. According to Facebook, its mission is to help its users stay connected with friends and family, discover what's going on in the world, and share what matters to them. It calls itself a content-neutral technology platform. So when the U.S. tech site Gizmodo reported this month that Facebook had been manipulating its supposedly algorithmically generated trending topics feature to suppress conservative news stories, that made headlines and prompted calls in the U.S. for a congressional inquiry. Facebook initially responded with a confusing series of statements, including a denial that the site is ideologically biased from its CEO, Mark Zuckerberg. Since then, Zuckerberg has met with some prominent American conservatives, and he's announced that the site is making changes to its trending topics section. However, this story is about more than just what's trending. It's about what is fast becoming the world's most powerful media company. 40% of all news traffic in the U.S. now originates on the site. And in a critical election year, Facebook is now facing the kind of scrutiny that for major players in the news business comes with the territory. Our starting point is Facebook's headquarters in Silicon Valley, USA.
What we're talking about with this controversy is a little section of small text headlines. On the Facebook homepage, if you're on the computer, you'll see it in what's called the right rail. It's to the right of your news feed, down below some birthdays and event invitations and stuff that you probably ignore. On the mobile app, which is actually how most people use Facebook these days, it's even more obscure. So this is really a peripheral part of the Facebook experience.
And until this moment, I don't think most people even recognized what it was. So I actually think that this uproar is about something else. Facebook essentially controls the marketplace of ideas. And that's a really powerful thing to control if you're living in a democracy. And we now have evidence that Facebook manipulates the marketplace of ideas.
The real fear or the real anxiety was just another reflection of the anxiety we feel over Facebook, having so much gatekeeper control on what more than 1 billion people see. And I think the trending topics story just ignited that concern.
The igniting was done by Gizmodo, a US-based technology blog. Its initial story quoted a former Facebook employee who alleged that editors at the site tended to downplay stories featuring conservative voices or pushing a conservative agenda. The Gizmodo article was based primarily on the trending topics feature, which Facebook only established in 2014. However, the concerns raised go well beyond that particular tool, provoking larger questions such as what kinds of news stories make it into our Facebook news feeds and why, and what algorithmic methods does the site actually use.
Now, what should we be concerned about? It's hard to know because Facebook's not going to show us that algorithm. They're not going to tell us how it works. But if you look at what type of news does well on Facebook, it's news that lends itself to an easy click, an easy share. It's something that you want to just hit like on automatically. And that kind of partisan content that's designed to stir up people's emotions does really well on Facebook.
What's happening is there's a computational process, an algorithm, that's looking at the hundreds of potential things to show you and thinking, what is she most likely to click on? So that slants the whole site. It's because the Facebook newsfeed algorithm is carefully engineered without your control and without any transparency or accountability to select particular kind of stories that are going to be clicked on and liked and shared and commented on.
Facebook's influence on the news industry is not limited to what has already been published somewhere else and then gets redistributed on the site. Facebook can drive news coverage through a feature called Facebook Signal. Even if you've never heard of it, most news editors have.
Signal is a tool that Facebook launched last year that is specifically tailored to journalists. And what it's designed to do is to tell journalists, here are some of the things that people are talking about on Facebook. And that's very helpful so long as the data is legitimate. The trouble, of course, is that there's always that possibility for abuse. Theoretically, at least, Facebook could manipulate that data if it felt that this was a topic we want to put on the news agenda. So we're going to give journalists the false impression that a lot of people really care about it or are talking about it right now.
Facebook issued a number of statements on the allegations in the space of 2 weeks, including CEO Mark Zuckerberg's assurance that the site's rigorous guidelines do not permit the prioritization of one viewpoint over another, or the suppression of political perspectives. Later, Facebook's legal department admitted it could not fully exclude the possibility of isolated improper actions or unintentional bias. It promised to make improvements. Zuckerberg also held a meeting with a dozen American conservatives, including some prominent pundits and the Republican chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee, who said the allegations were serious, an abuse of trust, and inconsistent with the values of an open internet. What no one explained was why Facebook must be ideologically neutral, while U.S. broadcast media outlets who jumped on the story don't have to be. Unlike most democracies, there is no regulatory requirement for broadcast outlets in the U.S. to be editorially balanced.
It's a good question why Facebook is being held to a different standard than media organizations, which obviously might have their political orientation. No one in Congress sees the need to investigate whether MSNBC is liberal or whether Fox News is conservative. Again, this is an issue of Facebook creating expectations that no media company can live up to.
I'm not calling for Facebook to be balanced. I'm calling for it to be accountable and transparent and reflective. And the idea of balance isn't that MSNBC or Fox News is going to be balanced.
The left are amazing at selling bad ideas.
But that you're going to have a media ecology that's going to be balanced. You're not just going to have Fox News or you're not just going to have MSNBC. With Facebook, you've got just Facebook.
If people don't have a basic trust that their views will be disseminated just as widely as someone else's, then that could really have an eroding effect on the Facebook business model. So there's really a lot at stake here for Facebook, not just here in the US, but also all over the world.
Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg is considered a visionary, but who could see this coming? Who could foresee a site that started as a social network growing, morphing into the biggest player in the global news business? Who could foresee that a platform that led the way in the social media revolution would now be struggling to keep up with itself and what it has become?
Facebook is acknowledging that they're moving from being a technology company and a social media platform to something far bigger and far more important to democracy. And that's a distributor of journalism. Because distributing the journalism doesn't just make you the delivery boy, it makes you an editor.
I don't think we've ever had a situation in which we had one gatekeeper that was so powerful. It has 1.5 billion users on 5 continents. They should have an ethics board. They should have something that corresponds to these structures we have for traditional media, like public editors, ombudspeople.
I even wrote a tongue-in-cheek job description for this public editor because I think it's an impossible job to do. That person should be independent and have a research staff and a budget that they could use to answer questions and be the arbiter and paid critic of Facebook. Any organization with a lot of power that takes itself seriously and has this much influence on democracy will spend money to enhance that credibility. And this is a logical move for Facebook.
On the download now, our viewers with some thoughts on the Facebook story and what it means.
Facebook has an important role to play in shaping the news agenda because it has 1 billion active users, way more than any media outlet. The trending topics bar is significant because the stories that appear there have a bigger chance of appearing in people's news feeds. which is the most important piece of real estate on Facebook. So if the company is selectively editing what appears in its trending bar, then it is implicitly helping to dictate what stories its users are most likely to see.
For me, the bigger issue is really that we don't know a lot about Facebook's motives or Facebook's values as much as we do with traditional news organizations. Traditional news organizations operate on a set of values and principles that include transparency and fairness, and Facebook isn't positioning itself even as a media company, it's positioning itself as a tech company.
Other media stories that are on our radar this week. In Kazakhstan, at least 44 journalists were amongst hundreds of people arrested by security forces there during nationwide anti-government protests this past week. The rallies took place in cities such as Astana and Almaty and were held in opposition to proposed land privatization policies. The Central Asian country, under the rule of President Nursultan Nazarbayev since the dissolution of the Soviet Union 25 years ago, has not seen demonstrations on this scale since the turn of the century. Amongst those arrested were reporters from Russia Today, Interfax, and Radio Free Europe's Kazakh service. Some said that their video recordings and their pictures had been erased by the police while they were in custody. But they said that the arrests were, quote, a misunderstanding, and that they would work to find out why the journalists were detained. The unrest follows an economic slowdown that coincided with the plunge of the price of oil, Kazakhstan's primary export. The proposed land reforms have now been postponed until 2017. Take a series of protests in France, a report by a Russian television journalist, throw in some dodgy translations of a few interviews, and you end up with a Moscow-based news channel with some egg on its face. The report was aired on Russia's biggest state TV network, Rossiya 1, on May 15th. The channel showed what it described as violent protests in France against policies dictated by the European Union. Then the French satirical television show Le Petit Journal, airing on Canal+, exposed how the report had been manipulated, how viewers had been misled, and how the EU angle had been fabricated.
Ce sont des manifs contre la loi travail El Khomri, donc rien à voir avec les eurosceptiques.
Le Petit Journal tracked down some interviewees who said that their words had been mistranslated or simply made up, such as being afraid of immigrants or accusing them of stealing their jobs. The Russian news media have been gunning for the EU ever since the Union imposed sanctions against Moscow following the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and have recently used the refugee story as the basis for some anti-EU propaganda. 4 months ago, another Russian outlet, Channel 1, filed a report from Berlin saying a Russian-speaking woman had been raped by Arab immigrants there and that German police had covered up the incident. That report has also proven to be untrue. There's been an interesting twist in that lawsuit involving former pro wrestler Hulk Hogan and Gawker Media, the gossipy, New York-based website. 2 months ago, Hogan, whose real name is Terry Bollea, was awarded $140 million when a jury sided with him when he said that his privacy had been violated when Gawker posted a sex tape involving him in 2012. Then Forbes magazine reported that Hogan's case has been bankrolled by a Silicon Valley billionaire, PayPal co-founder Peter Thiel, which the businessman later confirmed. Thiel and Gawker have a history going back to 2007 when Gawker exposed Thiel's sexuality before he came out as gay. Gawker's founder, Nick Denton, said he suspected someone in Silicon Valley might be financially assisting Hogan. If you're a billionaire and you don't like the coverage of you, and you don't particularly want to embroil yourself any further in a public scandal, it's a pretty smart, rational thing to fund other legal cases. Thiel defended himself, saying that I refuse to believe that journalism means massive privacy violations. It's precisely because I respect journalists that I do not believe they are endangered by fighting back against Gawker. This past week, the United States announced it had killed Mullah Akhtar Mansour, the leader of the Afghan Taliban, in a drone strike which took place in Pakistan. The U.S. has carried out an extensive drone war there since 2004. This most recent strike, though, took place over southwestern Pakistan, the first time the U.S. has targeted that particular region. The dateline on most drone strike stories is a place known as Fata, the federally administered tribal areas of northwest Pakistan. For more than a decade now, Fatah has been unstable and dangerous. Bordering on Afghanistan, the mountainous, inhospitable lands are home to Pashtun tribals and at least 6 militant groups. Reporting Fatah is a perilous assignment for any journalist to accept. The drone war, which has seen more than 400 strikes over the past 12 years, is one of the toughest stories to get at in the so-called war on terror. Reporting on the effects of drone strikes on the ground, on the people there, has led to a number of journalists getting killed. Fatah, and especially Waziristan, on its southern edges, is militarized and locked down. Few reporters even try to go there. The Listening Post's Meenakshi Ravi now with the story of one of them and what he's up against reporting on the state of war in northwestern Pakistan.
North Waziristan, remote, difficult to navigate, the heart of the Pakistani Army's most recent campaign to root out militants, Operation Zarb-e-Azb, and the site of more than a decade of US drone attacks. This is where Noor Behram works.
Noor Behram is a very unique journalist, local journalist from North Waziristan, who has shown tremendous courage in documenting a number of drone strikes.
By taking photos of survivors and families of victims right after an attack takes place. Actually, most of the photos that you see in the international media belong to Noor Behram.
Noor Behram was the first journalist who came to me saying, I have collected evidence of a huge number of civilians being killed. And that was a very unique perspective from a local journalist in Waziristan.
When the drone attack started, I saw a big difference between what was being reported and the actual reality on the ground. The breaking news would just say 5 or 6 terrorists have been killed in a drone attack. So I took it upon myself to give a voice to all those women and children who were killed. No one could call them terrorists or accuse them of participating in the fighting.
Behram's very presence and ability to do journalistic work in the federally administered tribal region is a feat of survival and smarts. Under the law, almost no local news outlets can operate in Fatah. All the newspapers and magazines the locals read are produced on the outside, in Islamabad, Karachi, Lahore, Muzaffarabad, and brought in for distribution. There are no TV outlets based in Fatah. There are 3 state-run radio stations and numerous underground radio outfits operating illegally. But journalism that interrogates the militants, the army, the US, co-opted tribes in the region, all of whom have a stake in Fatah, is almost non-existent. And then there are the pressures and very real dangers of living and working amidst groups like the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, the Haqqani Network, and elements of ISIL or Daesh.
Coverage is terribly difficult, without a doubt. It's tough to get there as a regular Pakistani. It's even tougher to get there as a journalist. And then when you sort of cross past certain areas from mainland Pakistan, well, it becomes a free-for-all. Your safety is not guaranteed. Most journalists who have been killed in the last decade or so in Pakistan have ended up being killed inside these regions.
You ask me what are the pressures created by the army, the government and the other intelligence bodies? Firstly, these are all individual players. You cannot consider them as one unit. You cannot prepare for them as one unit. Then there are the Talibs and the dozens of other organizations working here. Al-Qaeda, the Uzbeks, foreign militias, even Daesh. It means there is a constant clash of agendas and someone is always unhappy. And that's why they pressurize us journalists.
So for instance, in 2006, Hayatullah Mahsoud was killed. He was a journalist who had taken photos of missile parts of American Hellfire missiles. This was at a time when the US and Pakistan were both denying the fact that the US was bombing the tribal areas. And Hayatullah actually took photographs of these fragments and passed them on to a European press agency. The very next day, Hayatullah was disappeared for 5-6 months, and then his body was found shot to death.
That was 2006, one of the worst years for the media in Fatah, when a total of 3 journalists were killed. And the pattern continued. In 2007, print correspondent Noor Hakim Khan, killed by a roadside bomb. In 2011, Nasrullah Khan Afridi of the Khyber News Agency, blown up in his car. And last year, the Taliban claimed responsibility for the murder of Mohammad Zaman Mahsoud. For Noor Behram and his colleagues, survival is job one.
This is a tribal region. At night, there's no communication or phone system in place to relay news. Another thing, journalists have no access to information. Nobody listens to you, nobody talks to you. The Taliban and Al-Qaeda will simply call us up if they need us. But when we need a comment from them, there's no way of finding them. With all these problems that we face, we have to be very cautious, because if we get anything wrong, the impact could be significant for us and for our careers.
I went and made contact with people in the different villages, and they became my sources. They would notify me whenever there was a drone attack in their area through walkie-talkie systems. They would tell me how many women and children have died, and I would go to the area and gather evidence. No one records how many women and children are killed. Everybody knows which terrorists died and which didn't, but no one asks about the women and children casualties.
Keeping track of the dead is a very inexact science. According to the UK-based Bureau of Investigative Journalism's drone project, since 2004, between 430 and 970 civilians have been killed in drone strikes in northwest Pakistan. Noor Behram tries to put faces and names to those statistics, turning cold data into real stories. Journalists working in FATA say it's like reporting from inside the crocodile's den. But not everyone is interested, not even in Pakistan.
The most unfortunate part of Noor Behram's work has been that it was not appreciated by local outlets. In Pakistani media, this is not a top priority because the mainstream, especially English media, prioritize where their most readership is. So for example, Dawn is the leading English newspaper in Pakistan. Almost 60% to 70% of their readership is in Karachi. So for a person in Karachi, some drone strike happening in a remote area of Waziristan is not a priority.
The Pakistani media is facing a lot of threats and a lot of issues from a variety of forces. And so in that context, they have to be very careful in what they report and how they report. So you now have a situation where sometimes media houses will find it easier to publish a wire service report rather than publishing reported stories from their own journalists, and because it's safer.
What happens in Waziristan stays in Waziristan. That's been the logic primarily of both the security forces, the administration, as well as the bad guys. Stringers, local journalists are on their own, and they're between a rock and a hard place. The real challenge has been to walk that thin red line between your personal security, the sanctity of the Pakistani state, as well as your personal passion to tell the right story. It's been a very, very difficult story for all of us to tell, whether from mainland Pakistan or whether out in the mountains of Waziristan.
Finally, back to where we started, with Facebook. We've been going through some satirical videos about the site, the kind that don't make it into its trending topics feature. And a recurring theme is the rather Orwellian notion that the 1 billion or so Facebook users out there have served up some of their personal information on an online platter, which security and intelligence agencies can feast on without sending you so much as a friend request. One of our favorite videos was made back in 2014. Facebook had just turned 10 years old. It was made by the US-based comedy site Funny or Die. It takes a look back at Facebook through the page of its founder, Mark Zuckerberg. But then it also takes an ominous peek forward into what Facebook has become. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.